The Arizona dust did not simply settle, it invaded. It found its way into the seams of the white oak floorboards, into the folds of the linens, and into the creases of Eliza Hart's skin. It was a red, pervasive powder that tasted of iron and ancient, sun-baked stone, standing on the porch of what was once the busiest stagecoach stop in the territory. Eliza wiped her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, leaving a streak of mud across her brow. The silence of the desert was absolute. 3 years ago, this time of day would have been filled with the thunder of hooves, the creaking of leather suspension springs, and the shouting of drivers eager for a fresh team of horses. Now, the road to the east was empty, a ribbon of pale earth stretching toward a horizon that shimmered in the heat. The railroad had bypassed Hart's Crossing by 40 miles to the north, and with the iron horse came the slow, strangling death of the old trails. Eliza adjusted the weight of the Winchester rifle slung over her shoulder. It was a heavy, comforting burden. At 26 years old, she had learned that comfort in the Arizona territory rarely came from soft things. It came from cold steel, thick walls, and water barrels that were at least half full. The station stood behind her, a structure that had forgotten whether it was a home or a fortress. The adobe walls were 3 feet thick, designed to stop arrows and bullets alike. The windows were narrow slits, shuttered against the glare. It was a place built by her father, Jeremiah Hart, a man who had believed that civilization could be hammered into the desert floor like a fence post. Jeremiah was dead now. He had been dead for 2 years, buried under a pile of stones on the rise behind the corral, a victim of the very violence he had tried to tame. Eliza walked down the steps, her boots crunching on the gravel. She needed to check the water level in the cistern. The well was running low, the water table dropping as the summer heat intensified. It was 110 degrees in the shade, and the wind felt like the breath of a furnace. As she lowered the bucket, the rope chafing against her palms, Eliza caught her reflection in the dark water below. She hardly recognized the woman staring back. 10 years ago, she had been a girl in St. Louis who worried about the lace on her Sunday dress and whether her hair was pinned correctly for church. She had dreamed of a parlor with a piano and a husband who smelled of bay rum and tobacco, not horse sweat and gun oil. Now, her skin was tanned to the color of almond shells. Her hands were calloused, the nails cut short and practical. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting against the sun. She was a spinster by the standards of the territory, a woman who had stayed too long in the wild and had let the roughness of the land seep into her soul. She hauled the bucket up, the muscles in her arms corded and tight. She poured the water into the trough for the 2 remaining horses, a mare named Bess and a gelding she simply called Blue. They nickered at her approach, their velvet noses bumping against her shoulder. "Drink up," she whispered, her voice raspy from the dry air. It might be a long time before we get rain. The isolation was a physical weight. Sometimes she would go 3 or 4 days without seeing another human soul. When travelers did come, they were rarely the sort one invited to dinner. They were prospectors with madness in their eyes, drifters running from the law, or soldiers looking for trouble. Trouble was brewing. She could feel it in the air, thick as the static before a thunderstorm. News had come through a week ago with a passing supply wagon. The driver, a toothless old man named Silas, had spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and told her the rumors. "Best keep your doors barred, Miss Eliza," Silas had said, leaning down from his seat. "There is a devil loose in the hills, a Navajo buck, gone rogue. They say he attacked a silver convoy up near the Superstition Mountains, killed 3 men, cut them down like they were nothing but cattle." Eliza had felt a cold chill despite the heat. "Why?" she had asked. "Savagery," Silas had replied with a shrug. "They say he is a mad dog. The army is calling him a rebel, but the miners say he is just a beast that needs putting down. Marshal Monroe is organizing a posse, says he will bring the scalp back to town. Marshal Clay Monroe." The name brought a complicated knot of tension to Eliza's stomach. She finished watering the horses and walked back toward the house, her eyes scanning the ridgeline automatically. She looked for movement, for the glint of sun on metal, for the unnatural stillness of birds that signaled a predator. Clay Monroe was the law in this district. He was 30 years old, with shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. He was handsome in the way a predatory bird is handsome, sharp, intense, and undeniable. He had ridden out to the station 2 weeks ago. He had sat at her table, drinking her coffee, his hat resting on his knee. He had looked around the dusty, empty common room with a mixture of pity and disdain. "This is no life for you, Eliza," he had said, his voice smooth and deep. "Your father is gone. The stage line is dead. You are out here alone, defenseless, waiting for a band of renegades to burn this place to the ground." "I am not defenseless, Clay," she had replied, nodding toward the shotgun above the mantel. He laughed, a low, patronizing sound. "A woman with a gun is still a woman. You need protection. You need a home in town. I have bought that parcel of land on 2nd Street. I am building a house, a real house, with glass windows and a garden." He had reached across the table then, covering her rough hand with his. His palm was smooth, uncalloused. It was the hand of a man who held reins and pens, not shovels. "Marry me, Eliza," he had said. It was not a question. Really, it was a directive. "Let me take you out of this damn hole. You will be safe. You will be the wife of a marshal." She had pulled her hand away, feigning the need to refill his cup. She did not love Clay Monroe. She admired his strength, perhaps, and she certainly feared the loneliness that stretched out before her like the endless desert. But she did not love him. There was something in Clay's eyes that unsettled her. When he looked at her, he did not see a partner. He saw a territory to be conquered, a wild thing to be broken and fenced in. He wanted to own her, just as he wanted to own the respect of the town and the fear of the outlaws. Yet, the temptation was there. Every night, when the wind howled around the eaves and the coyotes yipped in the darkness, Eliza wondered how much longer she could hold on. The money was running out. The roof needed tar. The flour barrel was getting low. Marrying Clay would mean survival. It would mean safety. It would mean she never had to sleep with a knife under her pillow again. But it would also mean surrendering the one thing she had left herself. Eliza shook the thoughts away. She had work to do. She spent the next 2 hours repairing a section of the corral fence that the wind had battered loose. She used a heavy hammer to drive the iron nails back into the sun-bleached wood. The physical exertion was good. It kept her mind from wandering. As she worked, the rumors of the Navajo warrior played in the back of her mind. The miners called him a monster. They said he killed for sport. Eliza had grown up hearing stories of the brutality of the frontier, tales of scalpings and massacres on both sides. She had learned to fear the silhouette of a feather against the moon, but she also remembered the trade wagons that used to stop here when her father was alive. She remembered the Navajo women selling woven blankets with patterns that seemed to hold the geometry of the stars. She remembered their quiet voices and the way they moved through the land without breaking it. Her father's death was the shadow that lay over everything. It had been a night much like the one approaching. There had been shouting, the crack of rifles, the smell of smoke. The official report said it was a raiding party, a skirmish. Jeremiah Hart had gone out to defend his property and had been cut down. Eliza had been hiding in the cellar, terrified, listening to the boots on the floorboards above. When she had finally come out, the station was silent. Her father was lying face down in the dirt, a bullet hole in his chest. Clay Monroe had been the deputy then. He had told her it was the Navajo. He had pointed to the tracks, to the arrow stuck in the doorframe, and Eliza, blinded by grief and terror, had believed him. She had let that hate harden her heart, using it as armor against the world. The sun began to dip toward the western mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. Eliza put away her tools and went inside to bar the door. She lit a single kerosene lamp, the flame casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. She made a simple supper of beans and cornbread, eating in silence at the long wooden table that could seat 12 but now only seated 1. The emptiness of the room was loud. She looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, imagining her father sitting there, wiping his mustache with a napkin. "I do not know if I can keep doing this. Pa," she whispered to the empty air. After supper, she cleaned her rifle. It was a ritual. She stripped the weapon down, oiled the mechanisms, and reassembled it by touch. The metallic click of the lever action was the only sound in the room. She went to bed early, fully dressed except for her boots. This was a habit she could not break. In the borderlands, you had to be ready to run or fight in the space of a heartbeat. Sleep came fitfully. The heat lingered in the room, heavy and suffocating. Eliza tossed on the mattress, her dreams fragmented and feverish. She was back that night. The smell of burning wood was choking her. She heard her father's voice, shouting something she could not understand. She was running toward him, her feet heavy as lead. She saw him fall, but this time, the dream shifted. In her memory, the figures in the darkness had been faceless shadows. But tonight, her mind sharpened the image. She saw a man emerge from the smoke. He was tall, his hair long and black. He wore the buckskins of the Navajo. He was not holding a weapon. In the dream, the warrior ran toward her father, not to strike him, but to catch him. He reached out, his hands grasping Jeremiah's shirt, trying to drag him behind the cover of the water trough. He was shouting, looking back toward the darkness where the muzzle flashes were coming from. Eliza saw the warrior's face. It was twisted in effort, in desperation. He was trying to save him. Then, a second shot rang out not from the darkness, but from the direction of the town road. The warrior jerked back, letting go of her father, and fled into the night. Eliza woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in the bed. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her nightshirt was soaked with sweat. She sat there in the dark, trembling. The image of the warrior's face was burned into her retina. It contradicted everything she had been told. It contradicted the hate she had nursed for 2 years. "It was just a dream," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Just a nightmare." But was it? Or was it a memory that her grief had buried? Why had she seen him trying to help? Was her mind playing tricks on her? Or had she seen something that night that she had refused to accept? She could not go back to sleep. Eliza swung her legs out of bed and pulled on her boots. She grabbed the Winchester and walked out onto the porch. The pre-dawn light was gray and ghostly. The air was cool for the first time in 24 hours. The desert was holding its breath, waiting for the sun to return and begin the punishment anew. Eliza walked to the well, leaning against the rough stone. She looked out toward the east, where the sky was beginning to bleed into a pale, sickly yellow. The dream lingered, a ghost in the daylight. If the Navajo had not killed her father, then who had? And why had Clay been so certain, so quick to close the case? She looked at her hands. They were steady now, resting on the cold stone of the well. She felt a strange sensation, a prickling on the back of her neck. It was the instinct of a creature that knows it is being watched, or that the wind is shifting before a storm. She scanned the horizon. There was nothing but cactus and sagebrush and the endless, rolling dust. But the feeling persisted. Something was coming. It was not the stagecoach. It was not a supply wagon. Eliza racked the lever of her rifle, chambering around. The metallic sound echoed flatly across the yard. "Come on, then," she whispered to the empty desert. The sun crested the mountains, blinding and white. A dust devil swirled on the road, dancing like a spirit. Eliza Hart stood her ground, a solitary figure against the vastness, waiting for the trouble that was already riding toward her. The afternoon sun did not relent. It hung high and white in the sky, bleaching the color out of the earth until the world seemed composed entirely of bone and ash. Eliza Hart wiped the sweat from her upper lip with the back of her wrist, the leather of her gloves hot against her skin. She had been hauling water for the better part of an hour, a task that felt increasingly futile as the water table dropped inch by agonizing inch. She was turning back toward the house, the heavy wooden bucket splashing water against her skirt. When she saw him, he was not there. And then he was. It was as if the heat shimmering off the hardpan had coalesced into a solid form. About 20 yards from the well, a figure stumbled out of the brush. He took 2 staggering steps, his movements disjointed and fluid like a man drunk on bad whiskey. And then he collapsed face forward into the red dust. Eliza dropped the bucket. The water soaked into the parched ground instantly, disappearing as if it had never existed. Her hand flew to the stock of the Winchester leaning against the well wall. She brought the rifle up in a smooth, practiced motion, the buttstock slamming into her shoulder. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The silhouette was unmistakable, even face down in the dirt. The long, coarse black hair and the buckskin leggings screamed one word to her mind: Navajo. The stories Silas had told her, stories of the rogue warrior. The butcher of the mines flooded her senses. Fear, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in her mouth. She held her breath, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. She waited for him to move, to spring up with a knife or a tomahawk, to let out a war cry that would freeze her blood. But the man did not move. He lay with the absolute stillness of the dead. Eliza stood there for a long minute, the only sound the wind hissing through the creosote bushes. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered the rifle but kept it ready at her hip. She took a step forward, then another. The gravel crunched loudly under her boots, but the man did not stir. As she drew closer, the image of a terrifying monster began to dissolve into something far more human and far more broken. He was tall, likely taller than Clay, with broad shoulders that were currently hunched in unconscious agony. His shirt, a rough cotton trade shirt, was torn at the shoulder, and the fabric was stiff with dried blood. Fresh, bright crimson blood was still oozing, pooling beneath him, turning the red dust into a dark, muddy paste. He had no rifle. She scanned the ground around him. No knife belt, no bow. He was unarmed. Eliza frowned, confusion warring with her fear. She reached out with the toe of her boot, intending to kick away any hidden weapon he might have tucked beneath him, but stopped. The trail behind him caught her eye. It was a long, dragging furrow in the sand, spotted with blood, stretching back toward the rocky outcrops to the north. He had not walked here to attack her. He had crawled here to die. She knelt beside him, keeping the barrel of the Winchester pointed at his head. With her left hand, she gripped his shoulder and rolled him over. He was heavy, a solid weight of muscle and bone. His head lolled back, and Eliza sucked in a breath. His face was striking, carved from the same rugged, enduring stuff as the canyon walls. High cheekbones, a strong nose, and a jawline that remained sharp even in slack unconsciousness. But it was the vulnerability that struck her. His lips were cracked and parched, coated in dust. His skin was burning with fever. She could feel the heat radiating off him even through her gloves. The wound on his shoulder was ugly. A bullet had punched through the muscle, close to the collarbone. It was angry and swollen, the edges of the flesh blackened. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. Eliza jerked back, raising the rifle instantly. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice cracking slightly. "Do not move." His eyes were dark, almost black, but fever bright. They struggled to focus on her face, darting from the brim of her hat to the barrel of the gun. He tried to push himself up, his arm trembling violently, but the effort was too much. He collapsed back with a groan that sounded like tearing calm. "Water," he rasped. The word was English, but heavily accented. "You are the one," Eliza said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You are the one who killed those miners. The renegade." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze pinned her to the spot. There was no malice in it. There was pain, yes, and exhaustion, but beneath that lay a desperate, pleading sincerity. "No," he whispered. The sound was like dry leaves scraping together. "Tahoma. I am Tahoma." He swallowed hard, his throat working against the thirst. He switched to a language she did not know, a flowing, guttural stream of Navajo before forcing himself back to English. "Not like they say," he managed to choke out. "Not me." Then his eyes rolled back, and he slumped into unconsciousness again. Eliza stayed kneeling in the dust, the rifle heavy in her hands. "Not like they say." The words echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her prejudice. And then, the memory hit her. The dream. The nightmare she had woken from just hours ago. In her dream, the warrior had not been a killer. He had been a savior, reaching out to pull her father from the line of fire. The face in her dream had been a blur, a shadow. But looking down at the man Tahoma, she felt a bizarre, terrifying jolt of recognition. It was irrational. It was impossible. But the feeling that she knew him, or that she owed him, settled in her gut like a stone. She reached for the water bucket she had dropped. It was empty. She would have to go back to the well. But before she could stand, a sound cut through the desert silence. It was a sound she knew well. The rhythmic, thundering cadence of galloping horses. Many of them. And above the hoofbeats, the shouts of men. Eliza scrambled to her feet, shading her eyes against the glare. To the west, a cloud of dust was rising like a storm front. They were riding hard, heading straight for the station. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. It was the posse. It had to be. She looked down at Tahoma. If they found him here, passed out and bleeding, there would be no trial. There would be no questions. They would put a bullet in his head and drag his body back to town behind a horse. And if they found him here, at her feet, with her water bucket beside him, harboring a fugitive, aiding the enemy, in the Arizona territory, that was a hanging offense. Or near enough, at the very least. She would be branded a traitor. Her life at the station, already precarious, would be over. She looked at the approaching dust cloud, then down at the bleeding man. Logic screamed at her to walk away. To go stand on the porch and point a finger when the marshal arrived. "He is right there. I held him at gunpoint for you." It would be easy. It would be safe. It would buy her security and Clay Monroe's approval. But the memory of the dream held her fast. And the memory of Tahoma's eyes. "Not like they say." "Damn it," Eliza hissed. She grabbed Tahoma by the uninjured arm. He was dead weight. She gritted her teeth and pulled, her boots slipping in the loose gravel. "Come on," she grunted, straining against his mass. "Move, you stubborn fool!" She dragged him toward the only cover available, the gap between the main house and the wood pile. It was not enough. The posse was too close. She could see the individual riders now, the glint of rifles in scabbards. She changed course, dragging him toward the darker shadows of the stable overhang. It was 20 feet away. It felt like 20 miles. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Every muscle in her back screamed in protest. She hauled him into the shade, behind a stack of hay bales that blocked the view from the main road. She dropped him there, her chest heaving. She looked down at herself. Blood. His blood was smeared across the front of her work dress, a bright, condemning streak on the faded blue fabric. The hoofbeats were deafening now. They were in the yard. Eliza spun around, frantically wiping her hands on her skirt, trying to blend the fresh blood with the old stains of rust and dirt. She grabbed the bucket still lying on its side and walked quickly back toward the well, trying to compose her face into a mask of annoyance rather than terror. She had just reached the well when the riders thundered into the yard. There were 6 of them. Dust coated their coats and hat brims. The horses were lathered, blowing hard, their sides heaving. The men looked hard, their faces set in grim lines. Leading them, riding a massive gray gelding, was Marshal Clay Monroe. He looked every inch the hero the dime novels wrote about. His hat sat perfectly on his head. His duster swept back to reveal the pearl-handled colt on his hip, and his eyes were the color of cold steel. He reined the gray in hard, the horse dancing sideways. Clay looked down at her, his gaze sweeping over the yard, the house, and finally resting on her face. "Afternoon, Eliza," he said. His voice was calm, authoritative, but there was a tightness to his jaw. "Marshal," Eliza said, leaning against the well to hide the trembling of her knees. You are riding hard, chasing ghosts. Clay did not smile. He swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He walked toward her, removing his gloves. The other men stayed mounted, their eyes scanning the perimeter, rifles resting across their saddles. Not ghosts, Clay said. A wolf. We found tracks about 5 miles back. Blood. He is hurt badly. Eliza, he's heading this way. He stopped 3 feet from her. He smelled of horse sweat, tobacco, and the metallic tang of gun oil. He looked at the ground near her feet. Eliza's heart stopped. The blood, Tahoma's blood, was there, a dark, wet stain in the dust, right where he had fallen. She had dragged him away, but she had not had time to cover the spot where he had initially collapsed. Clay saw it. His eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, the leather of his boots creaking. He looked from the blood to Eliza, his gaze sharpening into something dangerous. That is fresh, Clay said softly. He pointed a gloved finger at the spot. What did you kill? Eliza. Eliza's mind raced. A coyote? A snake? No. Too much blood. A hawk took one of the chickens. She lied. The words tumbled out before she could check them. I took a shot at it, missed the bird, hit the hen. I had to finish it off. Clay stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He looked at the blood again, then at the rifle leaning against the well. A hen, he repeated flatly. I do not see any feathers. The wind took them, Eliza said, lifting her chin. She forced herself to meet his eyes. Or maybe a coyote dragged the carcass off while I was hauling water. I have been busy. Clay, I do not have time to conduct an autopsy on poultry. One of the men on the horses, a miner with a scarred face named Pike, spat on the ground. She is lying. Marshal, look at her dress. Eliza looked down. She had forgotten the smear on her skirt. Clay's eyes followed. He stepped into her personal space, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. He reached out and touched the stain on her dress, his fingers brushing her thigh. It was an intimate, possessive gesture that made her skin crawl. That is a lot of blood for a chicken. Eliza, Clay murmured. His voice dropped lower, for her ears only. Did you see him? Who? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. The Navajo, Clay said, his voice hardening. Do not play the fool with me. If he was here, if he threatened you. I have not seen a soul all day until you and your circus arrived, Eliza said. She took a step back, breaking his contact. She needed to divert them. She needed to send them away before one of the horses caught the scent of the man hiding 20 yards away behind the hay. She took a deep breath. But, she added, pointing toward the east, I did see dust. About an hour ago, over near the dry creek bed. I thought it was a dust devil, but it was moving against the wind. Clay turned his head, looking toward the east. The dry creek bed was a maze of ravines and scrub brush, a perfect place for a man to hide, and a terrible place to track someone. The dry creek, Clay said, weighing the information. If he is hurt, Eliza said, pressing her advantage. He would be looking for water. That is the only place with shade for miles. Clay looked back at her. He studied her face, searching for the lie. Eliza held his gaze, channeling every ounce of stubbornness her father had instilled in her. She let her annoyance show, let her exhaustion be the mask for her deception. Fine, Clay said abruptly. He turned back to his men. Mount up, we head east. Check the creek bed. If he is there, flush him out. He turned back to Eliza. He did not mount his horse immediately. Instead, he reached out and grabbed her upper arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her muscle with bruising force. It was not a caress. It was a warning. He pulled her slightly closer, his face inches from hers. You look tired, Eliza, he said. You look like a woman who is forgetting who protects her. I can protect myself, she whispered. Against the world, maybe, Clay said, but not against me. He leaned in, his breath hot on her ear. If I find out you lied to me, if I find out you helped that savage. He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished and terrifying. If you help him, Clay hissed, You will not be one of us anymore. You understand that you will be just another thing for the desert to eat." He released her arm with a shove. Eliza stumbled back a step, rubbing the spot where his fingers had dug in. Clay swung into the saddle with practiced ease. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that was now mockery. "Stay inside! Eliza, lock the door!" With a shout, he spurred his horse. The posse turned as one, thundering out of the yard and heading east toward the dry creek, chasing the lie she had given them. Eliza stood in the swirling dust of their wake until they were nothing but specks on the horizon. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt. She looked down at her arm. Even through the sleeve, she could feel the ghost of his grip. "Not one of us anymore." The words chilled her more than the desert night ever could. She had done it. She had looked the law in the eye and lied. She had chosen the side of a stranger, a savage, over the man who offered her a place in civilization. She turned and ran toward the stable. Tahoma was where she had left him, slumped against the hay bales. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. The pool of blood beneath him had grown. Eliza fell to her knees beside him. She put her hand on his forehead. He was burning up. "You had better be worth it," she whispered fiercely to the unconscious man. "You had better be worth everything I just threw away." She grabbed him under the arms again. She could not leave him here. If Clay doubled back, if he realized the creek was empty, she had to get him inside, into the hidden room, into the dark. Eliza Hart gritted her teeth and pulled, dragging the warrior across the threshold of her home, leaving a trail of blood that crossed the boundary between her old life and whatever dangerous future was now beginning. The storage room behind the kitchen was a place of ghosts and stale ambition. It was a narrow, windowless space that smelled of dry rot, burlap, and the sharp, sweet tang of corn whiskey. This was where Jeremiah Hart had hidden his illicit trade when the stagecoach profits had begun to dry up crates of moonshine bought from mountain runners and sold to desperate travelers at a markup. Now, it was a tomb for broken furniture, empty barrels, and one bleeding Navajo warrior. Eliza dragged Tahoma across the rough planks, her breath coming in short, stinging gasps. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone that seemed determined to pull her down into the dust with him. She managed to haul him onto a pile of old grain sacks she had hastily flattened into a makeshift pallet. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the small room, but his eyes remained closed. Eliza stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at him, in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wall. He looked less like a man and more like a myth that had crashed into her reality. His hair was loose, a cascade of black ink against the dusty sacks. His chest, exposed where his shirt had been torn, rose and fell in a shallow, jagged rhythm. She could not just stand there. He was dying. "Do not die on me," she whispered fiercely. "I did not lie to a marshal just to bury you in my root cellar." She hurried to the kitchen, moving with the quiet efficiency of a woman used to being alone. She grabbed a basin of water, a clean rag, a bottle of her father's remaining whiskey, and a pair of sewing shears. Her hands trembled as she gathered the items, the adrenaline of the encounter with Clay slowly curdling into a cold, gnawing dread. Back in the storage room, she lit a lantern and set it on an overturned crate. The golden light threw long, dancing shadows against the walls, making the cramped space feel even smaller. She knelt beside Tahoma. Up close, the smell of him was overwhelming copper blood, horse sweat, sagebrush, and the underlying scent of fever. She took the shears and began to cut away the ruin of his shirt. The metal blade snipped through the tough buckskin and cotton. She peeled the fabric back, her fingers brushing against his skin. She flinched. His skin was burning hot, radiating a heat that seemed unnatural. She had dressed wounds before. She had dug bullets out of horses and stitched up drunkards who had fallen off the wagon porch. But this was different. This was the enemy. This was the bogeyman the town whispers had warned her about. Yet, as she exposed his chest and shoulder, she saw no monster. She saw a man. His body was lean and hard, roped with muscle earned from a life of survival. There were old scars, white lines crisscrossing his ribs, telling stories of other battles, other escapes, but it was the new wound that held her attention. The bullet had torn through the deltoid, missing the bone by a fraction of an inch, but it had made a mess of the flesh. Eliza uncorked the whiskey bottle. The smell of alcohol filled the room. "This is going to hurt," she said to the unconscious man. She poured the amber liquid directly onto the wound. Tahoma's body convulsed. A sharp hiss of air escaped through his teeth, and his back arched off the grain sacks, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords of steel. His hand shot out, blind and instinctual, and clamped around Eliza's wrist. She gasped, freezing in place. His grip was crushing, even in his weakened state. The strength in him was terrifying. She stared at his hand, large, calloused, the skin dark against her pale wrist. It was a connection that felt electric, dangerous, and undeniably human. "Easy," she commanded, though her voice shook. "Let go. I am helping you." Slowly, the tension left his frame. His hand relaxed, sliding from her wrist to the floor, leaving behind white pressure marks that quickly faded to red. He did not wake, but his breathing hitched, settling into a pained rhythm. Eliza exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. She dipped the rag into the water and began to clean away the dried blood. She worked methodically, washing the dust from his shoulder, his neck, his chest. As she wiped away the grime, she found herself staring at the line of his jaw, the curve of his throat. She felt a flush rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the room. It was an intrusion. She was touching him in ways no unmarried woman should touch a man, let alone a stranger. Yet, beneath the propriety and the fear, there was a strange curiosity. He was so different from the men she knew from Clay, with his polished boots and soft hands, from the rough miners with their greed-filled eyes. Tahoma seemed carved from the earth itself. After she had bandaged the wound with strips of clean linen, she sat back on her heels, watching him. His eyes fluttered open. This time, there was no confusion between them. They were dark, lucid, and fixed squarely on her face. Eliza stiffened, reaching for the knife she had placed on the crate. "Do not move," she warned. Tahoma blinked, his gaze traveling to the bandage on his shoulder, then back to her. He did not look at the knife. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice was rough, like gravel sliding down a dry hill. "I had no choice," Eliza said defensively. "Clay Monroe would have shot you where you lay, and then he would have asked me why I had a dead Navajo in my yard." Clay Monroe. Tahoma repeated the name, tasting it like something foul. He tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. He slumped back against the wall. "The Wolf of the Valley. That is what we call him." "He calls you a killer," Eliza said. "He says you attacked a mining convoy, slaughtered innocent men." Tahoma let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Innocent men," he mocked. "Is that what you call men who ride into a sleeping camp at dawn, men who fire into tents where women and children are sleeping?" Eliza frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The mine," Tahoma said, his eyes burning with a cold intensity. "They wanted the water, the spring in the canyon. Our camp was there. We have been there for generations. But the silver company, they needed the water to wash their rocks." He looked at her, and the raw honesty in his face hit her like a physical blow. "They did not ask us to move," he said softly. "They sent riders. 20 men. They wore dusters and hats with a yellow stripe painted on the brim. They came with rifles and fire." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to spin. Hats with a yellow stripe. The memory surfaced, sharp and jagged. 2 years ago, a week before her father died, a group of men had stopped at the station. They were not regular passengers. They were hard men, carrying new repeating rifles. They had been loud, drinking her father's whiskey, boasting about a job they had to do for the mining syndicate. She remembered watching them from the kitchen doorway. She remembered the strange yellow paint on the brim of their hats, a mark of their gang. or perhaps a way to identify each other in the dust and chaos of a fight. One of them had looked at her with dead eyes and said, "We are going to clear out the vermin, little lady. Make this country safe for decent folk." Her father had been nervous around them. He had argued with them in hushed tones. And then, a week later, he was dead. Killed, Clay had said, by a Navajo raiding party. "Yellow stripes," Eliza whispered. "You know them." Tahoma said it was not a question. "I saw them," she admitted, her voice trembling. Before my father was killed. They were here. They killed my family," Tahoma said. "My sister, her daughter. I fought back. I killed 3 of them before they put this bullet in me. I am the only one left." Eliza stared at her hands. They were stained with his blood, but now the stain felt different. It felt like proof. If Tahoma was telling the truth and the detail of the hats was too specific to be a lie, then the men who had slaughtered his family were the same men Clay Monroe protected, the same men her father had dealings with. "If that is true," Eliza said, her voice barely audible, "then everything Clay told me, everything the town believes, is a lie." "The lie is easier," Tahoma said. "It is easier to believe the savage killed the white man than to believe the white man killed for greed." A heavy silence fell between them. Eliza felt the foundations of her world cracking. She had spent 2 years hating the Navajo, fearing them, using that hate to justify her isolation and her hardness. Now, looking at the wounded man on the floor, she realized she had been aiming her weapon in the wrong direction. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats outside shattered the quiet. Eliza jumped, knocking the basin of water. It sloshed onto the floor. One horse, moving slow, coming to the porch. "Stay here," she hissed at Tahoma. "Do not make a sound." She grabbed the lantern and blew it out, plunging the room into darkness. She hurried out, closing the door softly behind her, and ran to the main room. She checked the bar across the front door. It was in place. "Eliza!" The voice came from the other side of the heavy wood. It was Clay. Eliza pressed her back against the door, her heart racing. "It is late, Clay!" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am sleeping." "Open up, Eliza," Clay said. His voice was not the professional tone of a marshal now. It was lower, slurred slightly. He had been drinking. "I came back to check on you. I did not like leaving you alone out here with that animal on the loose." "I am fine," she said. "I have my rifle." "Go home, Clay." "This is not a request," Clay said, his tone hardening. "Open the door, or I will kick it in. I am the law. Remember." Eliza closed her eyes. She had no choice. If he kicked the door in, he would search the house. He would find Tahoma. She lifted the heavy wooden bar and opened the door. Clay stood there, framed by the night. He looked tired, dust coating his shoulders. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pushing past her. He smelled of stale tobacco and whiskey, not the good corn whiskey her father had sold, but the cheap rotgut from the saloon in town. "You are jumpy tonight," Clay said, looking around the room. "I told you, I was sleeping," Eliza lied. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, covering the blood stain she had tried to wash out of her dress. Clay turned to her. He did not look at the room. He looked at her. His eyes swept over her loose hair, her night rail, her bare feet. There was a hunger in his gaze that made Eliza feel naked. "I was worried about you," Clay said, stepping closer. "I rode halfway to the canyon, but I turned back. I could not stop thinking about you out here, all alone." He reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was rough, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Eliza forced herself not to flinch. She had to play the part. She had to be the fragile woman who needed him. "That was kind of you, Clay," she said, though the words tasted like ash. "Kindness has nothing to do with it," Clay murmured. He stepped in, closing the gap between them. He pressed his body against hers, backing her up against the wooden table. Eliza panic flared. "Clay, please, I am tired." "You are always tired," Clay said. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his unshaven chin scraping her skin. "You are always pushing me away. Eliza, why do you think you are too good for me? Or are you just playing hard to get?" He gripped her waist, his fingers digging into her hips. He tried to kiss her, his mouth wet and demanding. Eliza turned her head, his lips landing on her cheek. She felt a wave of revulsion so strong it nearly made her gag, but she could not fight him. Not now. If she fought, he would get angry. If he got angry, he would tear the house apart. "Clay, stop," she said, forcing a trembling note into her voice. "Not like this. Please. You are frightening me." Clay pulled back slightly. Looking down at her, he saw the fear in her eyes and mistook it for submission. He smiled, a slow, arrogant curving of his lips. "I just want to take care of you." "Eliza," he said, "why is that so hard for you to accept?" "I know," she whispered. "I know. Just give me time. Please." Clay sighed, releasing her. He walked over to the hearth and kicked a log into the dying fire. "Fine," he said. "I will sleep on the bench. But tomorrow, Eliza, tomorrow we are going to have a serious talk about the future. I am done waiting." He took off his gun belt and laid it on the table. He sat on the bench, pulling his hat over his eyes. Within minutes, his heavy, rhythmic snoring filled the room. Eliza stood frozen by the table, shaking. She felt dirty. She wiped her cheek where he had kissed her, scrubbing the skin until it stung. She waited 10 minutes, then 20. When she was certain Clay was deep in a whiskey-fueled sleep, she crept toward the back of the house. She slipped into the storage room and closed the door soundlessly. It was pitch black, but she could feel Tahoma's presence. "Did he hurt you?" The voice came from the dark, low and dangerous. Eliza fumbled for the lantern but decided against lighting it. "No," she whispered. "He is asleep. I heard him," Tahoma said. There was a vibration of suppressed rage in his voice. "He touches you like he owns you, like you are a horse he has bought." Eliza navigated through the dark until her knees hit the edge of the pallet. She sat down, her energy suddenly drained. "That is what men like him do," she said bitterly. "They stake a claim, on land, on water, on women." "It is not the way of the dying," Tahoma said. "Among my people, a woman belongs to herself. She chooses who walks beside her. If a man tries to hold her against her will, the women of the tribe would beat him with sticks until he learned respect." Eliza let out a dry, humorless laugh. "That sounds like a nice world." "It is the only world that makes sense," Tahoma replied. "Why do you stay? Why do you let him circle you like a buzzard?" "Because I have nowhere else to go," Eliza admitted. The confession hung in the air, stark and shameful. "This station, it is all I have. If I leave, I am nothing, just a beggar woman in the territory." "You are already nothing to him," Tahoma said gently. "You are just another thing to be put in a cage. Is that better than being a beggar, to be fed and watered but never allowed to run?" His words cut deep. Eliza thought of the fence she repaired every day. She thought of the walls she hid behind. She realized she had built her own prison, long before Clay Monroe had decided to become the warden. "I do not know how to run anymore," she whispered. She felt movement in the dark. Tahoma's hand found hers. It was hot, dry, and rough. He did not grip her. He simply covered her hand with his, a gesture of solidarity rather than possession. "Then you must learn again," he said, "or you will die in this cage." "Eliza Hart." They sat in silence for a long time, the darkness wrapping around them like a cocoon. For the first time in years, Eliza did not feel alone. She felt the pulse of the man beside her, steady and strong despite his wound. She felt the weight of his truth against the lie of her life. Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the shutters. Morning came with the brutal efficiency of the desert. The sky turned a pale, bruised purple, then bled into white. Eliza was awake before the sun. She had dozed fitfully in the storage room, leaning against a barrel. but she had moved back to the main room before dawn. When Clay woke, groaning and rubbing his neck, Eliza was already at the stove. Boiling coffee, she looked composed, her hair pinned back tight, her spine stiff. Clay took the cup she offered him. He looked at her over the rim, his eyes bloodshot. "About last night," he started. "Drink your coffee, Clay," Eliza said flatly. "You have a fugitive to catch." Clay grunted, seemingly relieved to avoid an emotional conversation. He finished the coffee in 2 gulps and grabbed his gun belt. He walked to the door, then turned back. The sunlight framed him, turning his silhouette into a dark cutout against the blinding world outside. "I am going back to town to get fresh horses and more men," Clay said. "We are going to sweep this whole sector, every ravine, every cave." And Eliza. She looked up from the stove. "I will be back by sundown," he promised. "We will search the station then too, just to be thorough. Procedure, you understand?" He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Be ready, Eliza." He walked out. Eliza listened to the sound of his horse galloping away. She stood in the silence of the kitchen, the coffee pot heavy in her hand. By sundown, she had 12 hours, maybe less. She went to the storage room door and opened it. Tahoma was already sitting up, his face pale but determined. He had heard. "We cannot stay here," he said. "No," Eliza replied. She looked at the shelves of canned goods, the walls that had sheltered her, the life she had clung to with such desperation. She set the coffee pot down. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something new was rising, a wild, reckless spark that felt like the wind before a storm. "We leave in 10 minutes, Eliza said. "Can you ride?" Tahoma stood up, swaying slightly, then steadied himself against the wall. He looked at her, and a slow, fierce grin touched his lips. "If you can help me on the horse," he said, "I can ride until the world ends." Eliza nodded. She turned and walked toward her room to pack her bag. She was leaving the cage, and God help anyone who tried to stop her. The sun was dying in the west, bleeding crimson across the Dragoon Mountains. When Eliza Hart turned the key in the lock of the stage station for the last time, it was a hollow, metallic sound that seemed to echo with finality. She did not look back at the grave on the rise where her father lay. If she looked, she knew she would not have the strength to mount the horse. They took the mare, Bess, leaving the gelding behind in the corral with the gate unlatched so he could find water or a new master. It was a calculated loss. One horse was quieter than 2, and Bess was sure-footed in the rock. "We ride west first," Tahoma said. He was leaning against the porch rail, his face pale beneath the dark copper of his skin, but his eyes were clear. "Then we cut south into the broken country. If we go straight to the canyon, Clay will track us by moonrise." Eliza nodded, handing him the canteen. She slung the Winchester over her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of the wood and steel against her back. "Can you ride?" "I can ride," he said. He mounted with a grunt of pain that he tried to suppress, settling into the saddle. Eliza swung up behind him. It was improper, intimate, and absolutely necessary. There was no saddle horn to hold. She had to wrap her arms around his waist. Through the thin fabric of his shirt, she could feel the heat of his skin and the rigid tension of his muscles as he favored his wounded shoulder. They rode out into the deepening twilight. The desert, which had been a furnace all day, began to exhale its heat, the air turning rapidly from scorching to a dry, biting chill. For the first hour, they did not speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of hooves on gravel, the sigh of the wind through the mesquite, and the occasional hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. Eliza pressed her face against Tahoma's back, smelling the smoke, the blood, and the earthy scent of him. It was a scent that should have terrified her, the scent of the enemy, but instead, it grounded her. The landscape shifted as they left the flatlands and entered the foothills. Giant saguaros stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in surrender or prayer against the star-dusted sky. The ground became uneven, a treacherous mix of loose shale and sharp volcanic rock. We have to stop soon, Tahoma murmured, his voice vibrating through his chest against her cheek. The horse needs rest, and the trail ahead is too dark for riding. Clay will have trackers, Eliza whispered, the fear like a cold stone in her gut. Clay is arrogant, Tahoma replied. He will look for a trail a white man would make. He will stick to the washes. We are going up. They dismounted at the base of a steep ridge. Tahoma led the mare, and Eliza followed, her boots slipping on the screen. The physical exertion kept the cold at bay, but her lungs burned with the thin, dry air. Suddenly, Tahoma stopped. He raised a hand, signaling silence. Eliza froze, her hand instinctively going to the rifle, far below them. On the valley floor they had just left, a series of flickering lights appeared, torches, lanterns. They moved in a serpentine line, like a glowing snake winding through the brush. He is moving fast, Eliza said, her voice tight. Faster than I thought, Tahoma admitted. He looked up at the ridge. We need to get higher, into the shadow of the cliff. If they look up and see our silhouette against the stars, we are dead. They scrambled upward. The terrain grew harsher. It was no longer a trail. It was a vertical struggle against gravity and geology. Eliza was tired. Her legs felt like lead. She placed her foot on a slab of slate that looked solid, pushing off to climb a small shelf of rock. The slate shifted. With a sickening grinding sound, the rock gave way. Eliza lost her footing. She scrambled for a handhold, her fingers clawing at the brush, but the momentum was too great. She slid down the steep incline, her body battering against the unforgiving stone. She felt a sharp, searing pain tear through her right side, a sensation like a hot iron being drawn across her skin. Eliza, Tahoma's voice was a harsh whisper. He dropped the reins and scrambled down after her, catching her arm just before she slid further into a patch of cholla cactus. He hauled her up, his grip iron hard. I am fine, she gasped, though the pain in her hip was making her vision swim. Just slipped. You are bleeding, he said flatly. Eliza looked down. In the pale starlight, her skirt was dark and wet. The rock had sliced through the fabric and deep into the flesh beneath, a long gash running from her hip bone down the outside of her thigh. We cannot stop here, she gritted out. They are too close. There is an overhang, Tahoma said, pointing to a dark cleft in the rock face 50 yards up. We hide there, now. They made the climb in agonizing silence. When they finally reached the shelter, a shallow cave protected by a curtain of hanging vines and a lip of stone, Eliza collapsed onto the sandy floor. The cave was small, barely high enough to sit up in, but it was out of the wind and invisible from the valley floor. Tahoma tethered the horse in a deep crevice further back where the animal's silhouette would be hidden. He returned to her, kneeling in the sand. He struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur making Eliza squint. He lit a small pile of dried sage and twigs he had gathered, keeping the fire incredibly small, shielding it with his body and the rock wall so no light would escape. The firelight cast a flickering, orange glow over his face. He looked exhausted, lines of pain etched deep around his mouth, but his focus was entirely on her. Let me see, he said. Eliza hesitated. The wound was high. It started at the curve of her waist and ran down past the top of her thigh. To show him the wound meant exposing skin that no man, not even a husband, had ever seen. I can do it, she said, reaching for the hem of her skirt. You cannot reach it properly to clean it, Tahoma said. His voice was gentle but commanded authority. And if we leave the grit in there, the fever will take you in 2 days. Do you want to die of rot in a cave? Eliza. He used her name. It was the first time he had said it without a title or a sneer. It hung in the air between them, stripping away the social distance. Eliza let her hand drop. She nodded. Tahoma pulled a knife from his boot. It was a rough blade, sharpened to a razor edge. I am going to cut the fabric. It is ruined anyway. Eliza lay back against the stone, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She watched as he carefully inserted the blade into the tear in her skirt. With a quick, precise movement, he sliced the heavy cotton upwards to her waist and downwards to her knee. He peeled the fabric back. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, her face burning with shame. She was exposed. The firelight danced over her pale skin, the dark blood creating a stark, violent contrast. "It is deep," Tahoma murmured. He sounded clinical, detached. "But it missed the artery." He pulled the cork from the canteen and uncapped the small flask of whiskey Eliza had packed. "This will burn," he warned. He poured water over the wound first, washing away the dirt and rock dust. The cool water felt shocking against her hot skin. Then, he soaked a piece of clean cloth in the whiskey. "Ready?" he asked. "Do it," Eliza whispered. He pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to the raw flesh. Eliza arched her back, a cry of pain tearing from her throat, which she instantly stifled with her hand. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. The pain was blinding, white-hot and consuming. "Breathe," Tahoma said softly. "Breathe through it." He began to wipe the wound, cleaning it from the knee upward. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the rough violence of the landscape they had crossed. His fingers were calloused, roughened by war and work, but they moved with the precision of a surgeon. He reached the top of the wound, high on her hip, just below the curve of her waist. He leaned closer to inspect the cut, his face inches from her skin. He dipped the cloth in the whiskey again and cleaned the deepest part of the gash. And then, his hand slipped. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the slickness of the blood and water on her skin. As he applied pressure, his hand slid upward, past the wound, over the curve of her hip and onto the soft, uninjured skin of her inner thigh and the sensitive hollow of her waist. It was not a graze. It was a firm, heavy contact. His palm cupped her hip. His fingers rested dangerously close to the intimacy of her groin. Eliza gasped, her whole body going rigid. The air in the cave seemed to vanish. Tahoma froze. For a heartbeat, a long, agonizing, suspended second, neither of them moved. His hand was still there, warm and heavy on her bare skin. The sensation sent a shockwave through Eliza that had nothing to do with pain. It was a jolt of pure, terrifying awareness. She was suddenly acutely aware of the heat of his palm, the roughness of his skin, and the strength in the fingers that were currently resting on her most private self. He was a man, not a savage, not a patient, a man. Tahoma's eyes snapped up to meet hers. In the firelight, his pupils were blown wide. There was panic there, an apology forming on his lips. But beneath it, there was something else, a dark, hungry recognition. He did not pull his hand away immediately. It was as if his body had betrayed his honor, refusing to break the contact. He started, his voice rougher than before. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He held his hands up, palms open, showing her he was unarmed, showing her he meant no harm. "I am sorry," he said. The words came out strained. "My hand, the blood was slick." Eliza looked at him. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it echoing off the cave walls. Her skin where he had touched her felt branded. She should be angry. She should have slapped him. A proper lady would have fainted or screamed, but Eliza Hart was no longer a proper lady. She was a woman bleeding in a cave with a man who was trying to save her life. "It is all right," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, but not with fear. Tahoma looked down at the wound, refusing to meet her eyes again. He took a fresh strip of cloth. "I need to bind it. I will. I will be careful." He leaned back in. This time, his movements were rigid, deliberate. He wrapped the bandage around her thigh and hip, sliding his hands under her leg to pass the cloth through. He was efficient, but every brush of his knuckles against her skin sent a fresh shiver through her. The tension in the small space was thick enough to choke on. It was a physical weight, heavy with the scent of whiskey, sage, and sweat. He tied the knot and sat back, wiping his hands on his buckskins. "It is done," he said, not looking at her. Eliza pulled the torn edges of her dress together, covering her leg. She felt strangely cold now that his hands were gone. She looked at him. watching the firelight play across his sharp features. He was staring into the flames, his jaw set hard. "Tahoma," she said softly. He looked at her then. "Are all Navajo men?" She paused, searching for the word, feeling the reckless danger of the question. "This gentle?" It was half a taunt, half a confession. It was an acknowledgement that he had touched her, and she had not hated it. Tahoma held her gaze. The fire danced in his black eyes. "Only with the things we wish to keep," he answered. The silence that followed was louder than the wind outside. Eliza felt the blood rush to her face. His words hung there, ambiguous and heavy. "Things we wish to keep." He stood up abruptly, moving to the other side of the small fire. "Sleep," he commanded. "We move at dawn." He lay down on the hard sand, turning his back to her. Eliza lay down as well, pulling her coat tight around her. The cave was small. Even on opposite sides of the fire, they were only feet apart. As the fire died down to embers, the cold crept back in. It seeped through Eliza's coat, making her shiver uncontrollably. Her teeth began to chatter. She heard Tahoma shift in the darkness. Then, she felt movement. He was sliding closer. "You will freeze," he said simply. He lay down behind her, his back to her back. He did not put his arm around her. He simply pressed his spine against hers, sharing the warmth of his body. Eliza stopped shivering. The heat from him was solid and steady. She lay there in the dark, staring at the cave wall, her mind reeling. She was lying back to back with a man the territory wanted dead, a man who had touched her bare skin, a man whose touch had made her feel more alive than Clay's kisses ever had. She realized then, with a terrified clarity, that she could never go back to being the woman who served coffee and waited for a husband. That woman had died the moment she let him drag her up this mountain. Sleep finally took her, but it was a light. Restless sleep filled with images of fire and dark eyes. The sun woke them. It was a brutal awakening, the light piercing the cave entrance like a spear. They ate a meager breakfast of dried beef and stale biscuits in silence. The tension of the night before tucked away under the necessity of survival. Tahoma checked her bandage. He was professional, distant, but his eyes lingered on her face for a fraction of a second too long. They rode out as the sun crested the peaks. The landscape changed dramatically. The gray scrub and shale gave way to towering spires of red sandstone. They were entering the canyon lands, a place of deep shadows and burning light. "We are close," Tahoma said around noon. "The Canyon of the Spirits. It is where my people went when the soldiers came." They rode through a narrow fissure in the rock, a natural gateway that opened up into a wide, hidden box canyon. It should have been a paradise. There was a stream running through the center, green cottonwood trees, and high walls that offered protection from the wind. But as they rode in, Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silence was absolute. No birds sang, no dogs barked. "No," Tahoma whispered. He slid off the horse before it fully stopped, stumbling slightly as his boots hit the ground. Eliza dismounted, wincing as her injured leg took her weight. She limped after him. The canyon was a graveyard. The hogans, the traditional earth and log homes of the Navajo, were black scars on the red earth. They had been burned to the ground. Charred timbers jutted up like broken ribs. Scattered across the ground were the remnants of a life interrupted. A broken clay pot, a child's doll made of corn husks, trampled into the mud, and bones, bleached, scattered bones that the coyotes had already picked clean. Eliza put her hand over her mouth, fighting back bile. This was not a battleground. This was a slaughterhouse. They said you attacked them," Eliza stammered, her voice echoing in the dead quiet. "The miners said the Navajo struck first." "Look," Tahoma said. He was standing in the center of the ruin, his arms hanging at his sides, his fists clenched so tight the knuckles were white. He pointed to the ground near the largest burnt structure. Eliza walked over. Lying in the dirt, half buried, was a silver necklace. It was intricate work, heavy and beautiful, set with turquoise stones, but the chain was snapped, as if torn from a neck. Next to it was a brass casing, a cartridge from a repeating rifle, a Winchester .44 40. The Navajo did not have those rifles 2 years ago. The mining security guards did. It was undeniable. The scene spoke of a surprise attack, a fire set to homes while people slept inside. My sister lived in that house, Tahoma said. His voice was devoid of emotion, which made it infinitely more terrible. She had a daughter, 6 years old. She liked to collect shiny stones from the creek. He walked over to the ruin and knelt. He picked up the broken necklace. His hands were shaking now, not with fear, but with a grief so profound it seemed to vibrate the air around him. He did not cry. Tears were a luxury for people who had hope. Tahoma looked like a man who had forgotten the word. Eliza watched him. She saw the set of his shoulders, the way he bowed his head over the piece of silver. The last brick in the wall of her prejudice crumbled to dust. She walked to him. She ignored the pain in her leg. She ignored the voice of her father in her head telling her to hate. She knelt beside him in the ashes. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out. She did not touch his shoulder or his arm. She placed her hand directly over his hand, the hand that was clutching the necklace. She covered his fist with her palm, pressing down, grounding him. Tahoma stiffened. He turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes were wet, swimming with a rage and sorrow that threatened to consume him. He looked at her hand covering his, a white hand on a red hand. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, opening his fist. He let the necklace rest on his palm, and he laced his fingers through hers. He squeezed hard. It was a grip of desperation. "They lied," Eliza said, her voice fierce. "They lied about everything?" "They took everything," Tahoma replied. "Not everything," Eliza said. She squeezed his hand back, looking him square in the eye. "You are still here." The wind sighed through the canyon, whistling through the burnt timbers. It sounded like a mournful song for the dead. But amidst the ashes, two hands remained clasped, forging a bond that was stronger than steel, stronger than law, and dangerous enough to burn the whole territory down. The ashes of the Hogans were cold, but the history they held was still smoldering. Eliza Hart stood amidst the blackened ruins of what had once been a home, her hand still warm from Tahoma's grip. The silence of the canyon felt heavy, pressing against her ears like water. It was a silence that demanded answers. Tahoma moved away from her, his movement stiff but driven by a singular purpose. He walked toward the remains of the largest structure, the one where he had found the necklace. He kicked aside a charred beam, sending a cloud of soot into the stagnant air. He dropped to his knees, digging into the packed earth floor with his bare hands. "What are you looking for?" Eliza asked, limping closer. Her leg throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm, a reminder of the night before. "My sister," Tahoma said, not stopping his frantic digging. She did not trust the white men who came with their papers and their promises. She told me once that if the world ended, she would bury the truth where the fire could not reach it. His fingers struck something hard. A metallic clang rang out, sharp and discordant in the quiet canyon. Tahoma brushed away the last of the red dirt and pulled out a metal lockbox. It was rusted at the corners, battered by time and heat, but the lock was intact. He did not bother with a key. He picked up a heavy stone and smashed it against the mechanism. Once, twice. On the third strike, the lock gave way with a screech of protesting metal. He opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the damp, were papers. Eliza knelt beside him, her breath catching in her throat. Tahoma handed them to her, his expression grim. "Read them. I can read the trail of a deer on stone, but I cannot read the spider scrawl of your lawyers." Eliza unfolded the stiff parchment. Her eyes scanned the ink, legible despite the crinkles. It was a land deed, a transfer of ownership for the entire canyon and the water rights to the spring, citing abandonment by the native population. But it was the dates that made her blood run cold. The deed was dated 3 months before the attack on the camp. It was a premeditated theft, legalized by ink before it was enforced by bullets. And there, at the bottom of the page, were the signatures. Samuel Pike, representing the Verde Valley Silver Syndicate, and below it, acting as the witnessing authority and guarantor of the claim, Marshal Clay Monroe. Eliza stared at the signature. The loops of the C and M were flourished and arrogant, the handwriting of a man who believed he owned the paper he wrote on. He knew, Eliza whispered, the horror settling in her stomach like lead. He did not just cover it up. Tahoma, he helped plan it. He signed the death warrants for your family so Pike could have his water. He sold us for silver, Tahoma said. He took the paper from her hand, his eyes dark with a hatred that was terrifying in its stillness. And he killed your father because he started asking questions about the yellow-striped men. Eliza felt a wave of nausea. The man who had sat at her table, who had held her hand and proposed marriage, was a monster in a duster coat. He had courted her while standing on the grave of her father, likely planning to secure the stage station land as well once they were wed. "We have to take this to the military," Eliza said, her voice trembling with rage. "The general at Fort Lowell, he hates the corruption in the Indian Bureau. If he sees this, if we live to show him..." Tahoma cut in. He stood up abruptly, his head cocked to the side. "Listen," Eliza strained her ears. At first, she heard nothing but the wind. Then, it came, the echo of metal on stone, the snort of a horse. "They are here," Tahoma said. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the canyon. But as they turned, they saw the trap. The Canyon of Spirits was a box canyon, a natural cul-de-sac with sheer red cliffs rising 300 feet on 3 sides. The only way in was the narrow fissure they had ridden through, and blocking that fissure, sitting high on his gray gelding, was Clay Monroe. He was not alone. Flanking him were 10 men, a mix of deputized thugs and Pike's hard-eyed mercenaries. They formed a wall of rifles and horseflesh across the exit. "Eliza!" Clay's voice boomed off the canyon walls, amplified by the acoustics of the stone. It sounded godlike, omnipresent. "I know you are in there, darlin'. I can see the horse." Eliza pulled her Winchester from her shoulder, checking the action. She had 6 rounds in the tube. Tahoma had nothing but his knife and the revolver he had taken from the dead miner back at the station, a gun with maybe 4 bullets left. "Stay behind the rocks," Tahoma ordered, pushing her toward a cluster of boulders near the canyon wall. "Do not let them see you." "He knows I am here, Tahoma," Eliza said. "He is not leaving without me." Clay's voice came again, smoother this time, dripping with that terrifying, reasonable charm. "Eliza, listen to me. I know you are scared. I know that Savage has twisted your head with his lies. But it is not too late. Step out away from him. Bring me the box he dug up. We can burn it together. We can go back to town, have a hot supper, and forget this madness ever happened." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. "I still want to marry you. Eliza, I am a man of my word. You walk out now, and you become Mrs. Marshal Monroe. You will be respectable. You will be safe. No one needs to know about your lapse in judgment." Eliza stood behind the boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Tahoma. He was crouched low, pain etched on his face, but his eyes were calm. He looked like a man who had already accepted his death. "Go," Tahoma whispered. "He will kill me, but he might keep you alive. Take the chance." Eliza looked at him. She looked at the man who had cleaned her wound with trembling hands, who had slept back to back with her to keep her warm, who had lost everything and still tried to save her. Then she looked out at Clay. He sat there in the sun, shining and righteous, the embodiment of the law, the town, and the civilization she was supposed to belong to. "He does not want a wife," Eliza said, her voice hardening into steel. "He wants an accomplice." She stood up. "Eliza, no!" Tahoma hissed. Eliza walked out from behind the rocks. She limped, her injured leg dragging slightly in the dust, but her head was high. She walked until she was standing on a flat shelf of rock, visible to the men at the canyon mouth, but elevated enough to offer some cover. There she is, Clay called out, a smile spreading across his face. Smart girl. Come on down. Eliza, leave the trash behind. Eliza reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, lace-trimmed handkerchief. It was white, embroidered with blue thread. E.C., Eliza and Clay. It was a gift he had given her months ago, a token of his affection. She held it up. The wind caught it, fluttering the delicate fabric. You promised me a home, Clay, she shouted. Her voice was clear, ringing off the canyon walls. You promised me safety, and I can still give it to you, Clay yelled back, opening his arms. Just come to me. Eliza looked at the handkerchief. It represented everything she had been told to want: a house, a husband, a place in the pews on Sunday. She opened her hand. The handkerchief drifted down, twisting in the air, landing in the red dirt like a surrendered flag. I would rather die in the dirt than live in your house, Eliza screamed. In one fluid motion, she raised the Winchester to her shoulder. She did not aim at the sky. She did not aim at the ground. She aimed directly at the silver star pinned to Clay's chest. Kill them, Clay shrieked, his composure shattering instantly. Kill them both. Eliza pulled the trigger. The shot cracked like a whip. The bullet missed Clay by inches, striking the pommel of his saddle and sending splinters of wood flying. His horse reared, screaming, throwing Clay's aim as he fired back. The canyon erupted. 10 rifles opened fire at once. The sound was deafening, a physical assault that battered the eardrums. Bullets whined off the rocks around Eliza, sending sharp fragments of stone spraying into the air. She threw herself behind the low wall of rock just as the spot where she had been standing was chewed up by lead. Stay down, Tahoma roared. He popped up from his position to her left. He held the revolver with 2 hands, steadying his aim. Bang, bang. 2 of the hired guns dropped from their saddles. Tahoma was not shooting to scare. He was shooting to kill. Flank them, Clay was screaming, wrestling his horse under control. Get up the rocks, pin them down. Eliza worked the lever of her rifle. Clack, clack. She peeked over the rim. A man in a dusty coat was scrambling up the scree slope to her right, trying to get an angle on Tahoma. She took a breath, held it, and fired. The man cried out, clutching his thigh, and tumbled backward down the slope. 3 down, Eliza yelled, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, wild and exhilarated. But they were outnumbered, and they were trapped. The remaining men dismounted, taking cover behind the rocks at the entrance, pouring a relentless suppressive fire into the canyon. The bullets chipped away at Eliza's cover, inch by inch. Dust and rock shards filled the air, stinging her face and blinding her. I am out, Tahoma shouted. His revolver clicked empty. I have 4 left, Eliza called back. They are coming up, Tahoma warned. Clay Monroe had dismounted. He had shed his duster coat, with a maniacal look in his eyes. He was climbing the rock face directly below Eliza's position. He moved with the strength of fury, ignoring the bullets, ignoring the danger. You think you can leave me? Clay roared as he climbed. You think you can run off with a savage and make a fool of me? He was not fighting for the law anymore. He was fighting for his ego. He was the spurned owner coming to reclaim his property. Eliza leaned over the edge to fire, but a bullet from below ricocheted off the stone next to her face, sending a shard of rock slicing across her cheek. She flinched back, blinded by the dust for a crucial second. When she looked again, a hand gloved in fine leather slapped onto the ledge of her shelter. Clay hauled himself up. His face was twisted, covered in sweat and dust, his eyes wide and white. You stupid bitch, he snarled. He lunged for her. Eliza tried to bring the rifle barrel around to strike him, but he was too fast. He grabbed the barrel and wrenched it from her grip, tossing it over the cliff edge. It clattered down the rocks. Useless. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. Eliza cried out, kicking at him with her boots, but he was stronger. He dragged her toward the edge of the drop. I will drag you back to town by your hair if I have to, Clay screamed in her face. And I will hang him while you watch. Let her go. Tahoma launched himself from his cover. He had no gun. He had a knife in his belt. But he did not have time to draw it. He threw his body at Clay. The two men collided, slamming into the rock wall. Clay grunted, releasing Eliza's wrist to grapple with the warrior. Eliza scrambled back, gasping for air. Her leg was screaming in agony. The wound had surely reopened. Tahoma was injured, weakened by blood loss. Clay was fresh and fueled by rage. Clay drove a knee into Tahoma's stomach, doubling him over, then slammed a fist into his wounded shoulder. Tahoma shouted in pain, his knees buckling. Clay drew his pearl-handled Colt from its holster. He pressed the barrel against Tahoma's forehead. "Goodbye, Redskin," Clay hissed. "No!" Eliza threw herself forward. She did not go for Clay. She went for his arm. She grabbed his gun hand with both of hers, forcing it upward just as the gun went off. The bullet sparked harmlessly against the canyon wall. Clay backhanded her. The blow caught her on the jaw, sending her sprawling across the rock shelf toward the edge. She slid. Her fingers clawed at the smooth stone. Her legs went over the precipice. "Eliza!" Tahoma lunged, ignoring the gun, ignoring Clay. He dove for her. He caught her hand. For a terrifying moment, Eliza dangled over the 30-foot drop. Tahoma lay on his stomach on the ledge, his wounded shoulder screaming, holding her entire weight with one arm. Clay stood over them. He looked down at Tahoma, who was helpless, using all his strength to save Eliza. Clay smiled. It was a cold, dead smile. "Problem solved," Clay said. He raised the Colt, aiming it at Tahoma's head. "I shoot you. You drop her. She dies. It's a tragedy. I kill the renegade who kidnapped her. I am still the hero." Eliza looked up. She saw Tahoma's face, strained and sweating. His eyes locked on hers. He would not let go. He would take the bullet before he let her fall. She looked past him at Clay. The man was savoring the moment. Eliza's other hand, her free hand, brushed against her hip, the pocket of her dress. The Derringer. It was a small, two-shot pistol her father had given her years ago. For emergencies. He had said, for snakes. She had forgotten it was there until the weight of it bumped against her leg. Clay cocked the hammer of the Colt. "Say your prayers," Clay said. Eliza pulled the Derringer. She did not have time to aim properly. She swung her arm up, firing blindly past Tahoma's shoulder. The small gun popped like a firecracker. It was not a killing shot. The bullet struck Clay high in the right shoulder, shattering the collarbone. Clay screamed. The Colt dropped from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the rock and sliding over the edge. He stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his balance gone. He stepped back into empty air. His eyes went wide with shock. He flailed, grabbing at the air, but there was nothing to hold. "Eliza!" he shrieked. And then he was gone. There was a sickening thud from the rocks below, followed by the sound of a body rolling through the loose scree. Eliza hung in the silence, swinging slightly in Tahoma's grip, with a groan of effort that sounded like it tore something inside him. Tahoma pulled. He dragged her up, inch by inch, until she could hook her leg over the ledge. They collapsed together on the flat rock, gasping, their chests heaving. Below them, shouting erupted. "The marshal is down! He is down! Pull back! Get him on a horse!" The hired guns had lost their paycheck and their leader. They had no stomach for fighting a ghost in a canyon that ate men. Eliza crawled to the edge and looked down. Clay was alive. She could see him writhing in the dirt. His men lifting him onto a horse. He was screaming curses, his voice ragged and broken. They turned and rode hard for the canyon exit, a defeated, dusty procession leaving a trail of blood in the sand. Eliza watched them go until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the wind. She sat back against the rock wall. Her dress was torn. Her face was bleeding. Her leg felt like it was on fire, but she was alive. Tahoma sat up slowly. He held his wounded shoulder, his face gray with pain. He looked at her. "You shot him," Tahoma said. There was wonder in his voice. "He was a snake," Eliza whispered. "I just did what my father told me to do with snakes." She looked at her hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. She had shot the law. She had shot her fiancé. She had severed the last rope tying her to the world of towns and churches and tea parties. She was an outlaw now. "Are you all right?" Tahoma asked. Eliza looked around the canyon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the burnt hogans. It was a place of death, but the air felt cleaner now. "I do not know," Eliza said honestly. "I do not know what I am." "You are free," Tahoma said. He reached out his good hand. Eliza looked at it. It was the hand of a warrior, a fugitive, a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and the truth in his heart. She took it. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I suppose I am." She squeezed his hand, and for the first time in 2 years, the tears came. They were hot and cleansing, washing away the dust of the Arizona territory and the ghost of the girl she used to be. She wept for her father, for the lost years, and for the man who had just fallen down the cliff, but she did not weep for the future. The future was terrifying, blank, and waiting, and she was not facing it alone. The silence that followed the gunfight was heavier than the stone walls of the canyon. It was a silence broken only by the ragged breathing of 2 people who had cheated death by the width of a canyon ledge. Eliza Hart sat slumped against the red rock, her hands trembling so violently she could barely wipe the blood from her cheek. Beside her, Tahoma was trying to bind his shoulder with a strip of cloth torn from his legging, but his movements were clumsy and slow. Clay's beating, combined with the earlier gunshot wound, had drained him. He looked gray beneath the copper tan of his skin. "Let me," Eliza said. Her voice sounded thin, like wind whistling through dry grass. She crawled over to him. The adrenaline that had allowed her to shoot a marshal and hang off a cliff was fading, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. But when she looked at the mess of blood on Tahoma's chest, a different kind of strength kicked in. "We cannot stay here," Tahoma rasped. "Clay is broken, but his men will regroup, or Pike will send others." "I know," Eliza said. She tightened the knot on his bandage, her fingers brushing against the warm, damp skin of his collarbone. "There is an army outpost at Black Rock Spring. It is 20 miles south. Captain Thorne commands it. He knew my father." "The army," Tahoma said, the word dripping with distrust. "Thorne is old," Eliza replied, meeting his gaze. "He hates the mining syndicate more than he hates the Apache or the Navajo. He calls them vultures. If we show him the papers, if he sees Clay's signature alongside Pike's, he will have to act." It was a gamble, but it was the only card they had left to play. They descended the canyon in the violet haze of twilight. It was a torture of slipping boots and grinding pain. Eliza's leg, reopened during the struggle, throbbed with every step, bleeding fresh into the bandage. Tahoma moved like a man walking through deep water, his weight leaning heavily against the rock wall. They found the mare, Bess, waiting nervously near the canyon entrance. The animal was skittish, smelling the blood and the lingering scent of powder. But she held steady as Tahoma pulled himself into the saddle. He reached down, gripping Eliza's forearm, and swung her up behind him. The ride south was a blur of misery and endurance. The desert night was freezing, a sharp contrast to the brutal heat of the day. Eliza wrapped her arms around Tahoma's waist, pressing her face against his back to shield herself from the wind. She could feel every hitch in his breath, every tremor that ran through his frame. Sometime after midnight, they stopped in a dry wash to rest the horse. They could not risk a fire, not yet. Eliza slid off the horse and nearly collapsed as her leg gave way. Tahoma caught her, his good arm hooking around her waist. For a moment, they just stood there in the dark, holding each other up, 2 broken things leaning together to make something whole. "Sit," Eliza commanded gently. She made him sit on a flat rock. She took the canteen and the last of the whiskey. "Shirt off," she said. Tahoma hesitated, then awkwardly peeled the ruined remains of his shirt over his head. Eliza sucked in a breath. In the moonlight, the bruising from Clay's fists was blooming across his ribs like dark ink. The gunshot wound was angry and swollen. She poured water onto a rag and began to clean him. She started at his neck, wiping away the sweat and the grime of the fight. She moved down to his chest, her hand lingering over the steady beat of his heart. This was different from the cave. In the cave, there had been fear and the shock of accidental intimacy. Now, the fear is gone. There was only a profound, quiet recognition. She washed the blood from his skin, her movements slow and deliberate. She touched the scars of old battles and the fresh bruises of the new one. When her fingers grazed the skin near his heart, Tahoma watched her face. He did not pull away. He did not apologize. He simply let her tend to him, surrendering his warrior's guard in a way that felt more intimate than any kiss. "You possess hands that heal," Tahoma murmured, "but you shoot like a demon." Eliza let out a soft, tired laugh. "My father wanted a son. He got me. So he taught me to mend fences and load a pistol. I never thought I would use both on the same day. You saved me," he said. The statement was simple, heavy with weight. "You caught me," she replied, looking at his hand, the hand that had held her over the abyss. "I suppose we are even." She finished bandaging him. Her hand rested on his bare shoulder for a moment longer than necessary. The heat of his skin seemed to seep into her palm, traveling up her arm and settling in her chest. "We are not even," Tahoma whispered. "I owe you a life. Eliza Hart." They rode on until the sky began to turn the color of a bruised plum. Just before dawn, they entered a narrow ravine that cut through the red mesas. Suddenly, Bess whinnied and shied sideways. Figures materialized from the rocks above, silent, ghost-like shapes holding bows and old rifles. "Navajo." Tahoma shouted something in his own tongue, a sharp, guttural command. He raised his hands, palms out. The figures descended. There were 6 of them, ragged, thin, with eyes that held the hardness of the desert. They were survivors of the raids, a splinter group hiding in the Badlands. An older woman stepped forward. Her hair was gray, tied back with a leather thong. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles etched by sun and sorrow. She wore a blanket woven with fading colors. She looked at Tahoma, and her expression softened into recognition. She touched his knee where he sat on the horse. Then she looked at Eliza. The softness vanished. Her eyes became flint. She spat on the ground near the horse's hooves. She spoke sharply to Tahoma, gesturing at Eliza with a hand that looked like a claw. "She says you bring death with you," Tahoma translated quietly, not looking at Eliza. "She says the white woman is a disease. She asks why I carry the enemy on my back." Eliza stiffened. She felt the judgment of the woman, heavy and absolute. It was the reverse of the town's prejudice, but it cut just as deep. To this woman, Eliza was not an individual. She was a symbol of the people who had burned their homes. Tahoma slid from the horse. He stood tall despite his pain. He spoke to the old woman, his voice rising in passion. He pointed to the north, toward the canyon. He mimed the act of shooting. He pointed to Eliza, then to his own heart. He pulled the metal lockbox from the saddlebag and held it up. Shaking it, the other Navajo lowered their weapons. They looked at Eliza with new eyes, not friendly, but confused, wary. Tahoma turned to Eliza. "I told her," he said. "I told her you put a bullet in the wolf of the valley. I told her you gave up your home to pull me from the fire." The old woman stepped closer to Eliza. She reached out a hand, her skin like dry parchment, and touched the hem of Eliza's torn, blood-stained dress. She looked at the wound on Eliza's leg, then up at her face. There was no smile, but the hostility had receded, replaced by a grudging, silent respect. She nodded once, a sharp jerk of her chin, and stepped back. It was not a welcome. It was a ceasefire. They shared water and dried meat with the group. When they prepared to leave for the outpost, the old woman pressed a small pouch of corn pollen into Tahoma's hand. She said nothing to Eliza, but she did not spit again. "She will not thank you," Tahoma said as they rode away. "But she will not forget you." "That is enough," Eliza said. "I did not do it for thanks." They reached the perimeter of the army outpost by mid-morning. It was a bleak collection of timber buildings and white canvas tents surrounded by a stockade fence. The American flag hung limp in the still air. The sentries challenged them immediately, rifles raised. A white woman riding double with a Navajo warrior, both covered in blood and dust, was a sight that broke every regulation and expectation. "I am Eliza Hart," she called out, her voice cracking with thirst. "Daughter of Jeremiah Hart, I need to see Captain Thorne. Now!" 10 minutes later, they were standing in the captain's office. It smelled of stale tobacco smoke, ink, and oiled leather. Captain Silas Thorne was a man carved from oak. He was 60 years old, with a white mustache and eyes that had seen too much death. He sat behind his desk, looking from Eliza to Tahoma, and then to the metal box on the desk. He read the papers. He read them slowly, his frown deepening with every line. He looked at the map of the water rights. He looked at the signatures. Finally, he set the papers down. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter. He pushed one toward Eliza, and, after a pause, pushed the second one toward Tahoma. "Samuel Pike," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. "I always knew that man was a snake, but I never thought he would be stupid enough to write it down." "And Monroe?" Eliza asked. "Clay Monroe." Thorne spat the name. "A disgrace to the badge. If he is dead, the territory is better for it. If he is alive, he will wish he was dead when I am done with him." Thorne leaned back in his chair. "I will send a detachment to the mines within the hour. We will arrest Pike. These papers. This is fraud, conspiracy, and murder. The federal judge in Prescott is a hard man, but he is honest. He will hang them." Eliza felt a wave of relief so strong her knees nearly buckled. It was over. The truth was out. But Thorne was not finished. He looked at Eliza, and his expression turned pitying. "You did a brave thing, Miss Hart," he said. "But you know what this means." "I know," Eliza said. "The town," Thorne said, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "The people there. They rely on that mine. Pike employs half the men in the valley. And Clay, well, Clay was their golden boy. You just destroyed their hero and threatened their livelihood." He paused, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Even with the truth on paper," Thorne said softly, "they will never forgive you for siding with a Navajo against a white man. You cannot go back to that stage station. Eliza, they will burn you out." The room was silent. Tahoma stood by the door, still as a statue, watching her. "I know," Eliza repeated. "I never intended to go back." Thorne nodded slowly. "Good. You are smart." He stood up. "I can give you supplies, a fresh horse. I can wire money from the sale of your station's goods to a bank in San Francisco or St. Louis. You could start over, a new name, a new life." Eliza looked at the whiskey in her glass. The amber liquid caught the light. San Francisco, St. Louis, places with paved streets, gas lamps, and polite society. Places where she could wear silk and never see a drop of blood in the dust again. She looked up at Tahoma. He was waiting. He did not speak. He did not plead. His face was a mask, but his eyes were burning holes in her soul. In them, she saw the reflection of the fire in the cave, the stars over the desert, and the raw, terrifying freedom of the canyon. "Thank you, Captain," Eliza said. "I will take the supplies, but I do not think I will be going to St. Louis." Thorne looked from her to the warrior. He sighed, a sound of resignation. "It is a hard life out there, Eliza." "It is the only life I have got," she replied. That night, they camped just outside the stockade walls. The captain had allowed them to stay within the perimeter for safety, but Eliza felt suffocated by the fences. She stood by the gate, looking out at the darkness. In the distance, across the valley, she could see the faint glow of a campfire, the Navajo survivors. Tahoma walked up beside her. He moved silently, like a shadow detaching itself from the night. "The captain offered you a ticket to the city," Tahoma said. "He did," Eliza answered. "You could have soft beds," Tahoma said. "Ice in your water, no dust." "I suppose I could," Eliza said. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the silver cross her mother had given her. It was a beautiful thing, delicate and pure. It belonged to a woman who prayed in church and feared the wilderness. She pulled it out. the silver gleamed in the starlight. Then, with her other hand, she reached into the pocket of her torn dress and pulled out the necklace Tahoma had found in the ashes. The turquoise and silver loop, broken but heavy with history. She looked at the cross. Then she looked at the turquoise. One was safety. The other was the truth. One was the past. The other was the man standing beside her. Slowly, deliberately, Eliza wrapped the chain of the cross around her fingers. She did not throw it away. That would be disrespectful to the girl she used to be. Instead, she placed it deep into her saddlebag, tucking it inside a folded handkerchief. She was putting it away, archiving it. She turned to Tahoma. She held up the broken turquoise necklace. "Can this be fixed?" she asked. Tahoma looked at the necklace, then at her. A slow realization dawned in his eyes, breaking the stoic mask. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It can be mended. My uncle is a silversmith. He is with the group in the hills. Then we should go find him," Eliza said. She stepped closer to him. She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "I am not going to St. Louis." "Tahoma," she whispered. "I am going where you go." Tahoma covered her hand with his. He lowered his forehead until it rested against hers. "It will be a hard road," he whispered. "The wind never stops. The sun has no mercy." "I am not afraid of the sun anymore," Eliza said. He pulled her into his arms. It was not a desperate embrace like on the cliff, nor a comforting one like in the cave. It was a claim. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world of shifting sand. Eliza closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of sage and smoke. Behind her, the lights of the army post flickered, civilized and safe. But ahead, in the dark, the fire of the Navajo camp burned steady and true. She had chosen her side, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. The wind at the Black Rock outpost did not smell of sage and freedom. It smelled of lye soap, manure, and the rigid, starch-stiffened regulations of the United States Army. For 3 days, Eliza Hart had existed within these wooden walls, a guest of the government, waiting for the machinery of justice to grind its slow, rusty gears. News arrived on the 4th morning, carried by a courier on a lathered horse. The report was mixed, a cocktail of victory and bitterness that Eliza swallowed with her morning coffee. Samuel Pike had been arrested at the mines. He had been dragged out of his office in cuffs, shouting about his connections in Washington. But the signature on the land deed was a chain he could not break. He would stand trial in Prescott, but Clay Monroe was gone. The courier reported that the marshal had not returned to town. His men, those who had survived the canyon, claimed he had ridden south toward the Mexican border, nursing a shattered shoulder and a heart full of venom. He had been stripped of his badge in absentia, declared a fugitive for corruption and attempted murder. It was justice, of a sort. The paper tigers had been torn down. But as Eliza looked out the window of the barracks toward the distant purple mountains, she knew that a court verdict could not unburn a home. It could not bring back the dead sister or the child who had liked shiny stones. The law could punish the guilty, but it could not heal the wound. Later that afternoon, a second rider arrived. He carried the mail sack from Hart's Crossing. There was one letter addressed to Eliza. She sat on the edge of her cot to read it. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive. The seal was the official stamp of the town council. "Dear Miss Hart, in light of your prolonged absence and the disturbing reports regarding your association with hostile elements, the council has voted to invoke the Territory Abandonment Clause. The property known as Hart Station is hereby seized by the municipality for the purpose of public safety and auction. Furthermore, be advised that your presence within the town limits is considered a provocation to public order. We suggest you seek residence elsewhere." Eliza read the letter twice. Then she folded it neatly and placed it on the small table. She should have felt anger. She should have felt the outrage of a woman who had bled to keep that station standing, who had buried her father in its soil. But instead, she felt a strange, weightless sensation. It was the feeling of a rope being cut, the last anchor that held her to the world of corsets, tea parties, and polite hypocrisy had just been severed. They had stolen her home, yes, but in doing so, they had inadvertently given her the one thing she had been too afraid to take for herself: absolute freedom. She stood up and smoothed her skirt. It was a new dress, provided by the captain's wife, a simple calico print that fit poorly around the shoulders. It felt like a costume. Eliza walked to the headquarters building. Captain Thorne was waiting for her. On his desk sat a small canvas pouch. "The courier brought this as well," Thorne said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I liquidated the inventory left at your station before the council could get their hands on it. The horses, the tools, the whiskey." He pushed the pouch across the desk. It clinked heavily. $250, Thorne said. "It is not a fortune, Eliza, but it is enough to get you to California. Or back east." Eliza picked up the pouch. It was heavy. It represented 10 years of her father's labor, 10 years of fighting the dust and the heat. $250. That was the price of a life in the Arizona Territory? "Thank you, Captain," Eliza said. "You have been kind to me when you did not have to be." Thorne looked at her, his eyes sad under his bushy white brows. "It is all the law can do for you. Eliza, I wish it were more." "The law has done enough," Eliza replied. "It settled the score. The rest is up to me." She turned to leave, but Thorne cleared his throat. "He is waiting for you," the captain said. "By the north gate." Eliza paused, her hand on the doorknob. "He is a good man," Thorne added quietly, "for a Navajo, but it is a hard road you are choosing. There are no stagecoaches where he is going, no doctors, no law." "I think I have had enough of the law for one lifetime," Eliza said. She walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. The north gate of the outpost opened onto the vast, rolling scrubland that led up into the Dragoon Mountains. The air here was thinner, sharper. Tahoma was there. He sat on his horse, a paint mare with intelligent eyes. He wore a fresh shirt the soldiers had traded him, but he still wore his buckskin leggings and the moccasins of his people. His shoulder was bandaged beneath the fabric, and he held his arm stiffly against his side. But his posture was upright. He looked like a part of the landscape, as permanent and unyielding as the red rocks. Beside him, tethered to his saddle horn, was a second horse. It was a sturdy roan gelding, saddled and ready. He did not smile when he saw her. He watched her walk across the dusty parade ground, his dark eyes tracking every step. Eliza stopped a few feet away. She clutched the money pouch in one hand and her small bundle of belongings in the other. "The captain says you are leaving," Eliza said. "The wind is changing," Tahoma replied. His voice was low, carrying effortlessly over the distance between them. "My people are moving higher. The soldiers are building a railroad through the valley. Iron and noise. We go where the iron cannot follow." He looked at the pouch in her hand. "You have gold," he noted. "You can buy a ticket to a soft life." "I have $250, Eliza corrected. "And a letter telling me I am not welcome in the town I was born in." She looked back over her shoulder. To the south lay the road that led to Hart's Crossing. If she walked that road, she knew exactly what awaited her. The whispers in the general store. The women pulled their skirts aside when she passed. The men looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. The woman who had run off with a savage. She would be an outcast, a curiosity, a cautionary tale told to young girls. She looked back at Tahoma. He was not offering her a promise. He was not offering a house with glass windows or a name that commanded respect in the bank. "I do not have a ring for you," Tahoma said. "I do not have a church. I cannot promise you that we will not be hungry, or cold, or hunted." He leaned forward slightly, resting his good hand on the pommel of his saddle. "But you can come," he said, "or you can go the other way. That is your choice, Eliza. But I will not let you walk alone. If you take the southern road, I will ride behind you until you are safe in the city. If you take the northern trail..." He left the sentence hanging, suspended in the dry air. Eliza looked at the roan horse. Then she looked at the horizon behind Tahoma. It was jagged, wild, and beautiful. It was a place where the maps were drawn by memory and water, not by surveyors and ink. She walked up to the roan. She tied the money pouch to the saddle. It would buy blankets, ammunition, and grain. It would be useful, but it was just metal. She grabbed the pommel and swung herself up. Her legs still ached, a dull throb that reminded her she was alive. She settled into the saddle and gathered the reins. She turned her horse not toward the south, but toward the north, aligning herself alongside Tahoma. "I never liked the city," Eliza said. "Too many walls." A slow smile broke across Tahoma's face. It was rare, like rain in the desert, and it changed his whole demeanor. It was a smile of relief, of joy, and of profound respect. "Then let us ride," he said. Before the dust settles, they kicked their horses into a trot, leaving the outpost behind. They did not look back at the flag, or the fences, or the captain watching them from his window. They rode for hours. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in riotous shades of violent orange and deep violet. The landscape changed around them. The scrub brush gave way to pinon pine and juniper. The air grew cooler, scented with resin and damp earth. Here, in the shadow of the mountains, there were no property lines. There were no fences to mend. There were no expectations to meet. Eliza felt a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in years. She looked at Tahoma riding beside her. He rode with an easy grace, his body moving in rhythm with the horse. He was not her owner. He was not her savior. He was her equal. They were two survivors who had found each other in the wreckage of the world, and now they were building a new one. Theme of freedom. No paper defined this. No judge had signed a decree allowing them to be together. The only law here was the one they wrote with every mile they put between themselves and the past. By nightfall, they reached the new camp. It was hidden in a high box canyon, protected by sheer cliffs and accessible only by a narrow, twisting trail. As they rode in, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat greeted them. There were only about 30 people, the remnants of 3 different bands that had merged for survival. Men were sharpening tools by the fire. Children were playing a quiet game with sticks in the dirt. When they saw Tahoma, a murmur went through the camp. They stood to greet him, their faces a mix of relief and curiosity. Then they saw Eliza. The silence returned. It was not the hostile silence of the first meeting, but it was cautious. They watched her white skin, her calico dress, the way she sat on the horse. They were looking for the enemy. Tahoma dismounted and helped Eliza down. Her legs were stiff, and she stumbled slightly. He caught her arm, steadying her. He spoke to the group in Navajo. His voice was strong, carrying the weight of his journey. He gestured to Eliza, then to the south where the conflict had been. He used the word "dine the people" and linked it with her name. The crowd parted. The old woman, the grandmother who had met them in the ravine, stepped forward. She carried a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. She walked up to Eliza, her black eyes searching Eliza's face for any sign of fear or deceit. Finding none, the old woman nodded. She unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a necklace. It was not silver. It was made of polished white bone and chunks of raw, sky blue turquoise, strung on a sturdy leather cord. It was ancient and simple, smelling of earth and time. The old woman held it out. "She says," Tahoma translated softly, standing close to Eliza's ear, "that silver is for trade. Silver is what the white man wants, but bone is life, and turquoise is the sky." Eliza looked at the necklace. "She says," Tahoma continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that if you wear this, you are no longer a guest. You are of the canyon. You stay. No priest, no judgment. This is the vow." Eliza took the necklace. The bone was warm in her hand. It felt heavier than the bag of gold coins she had carried. It felt like a soul. She handed it to Tahoma. "Put it on me," she whispered. Tahoma took the necklace. He moved behind her. Eliza lifted her hair, exposing the nape of her neck to the cool mountain air. She felt his hands. They were rough, calloused, and scarred, but his touch was reverent. He placed the leather cord around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, lingering there, tracing the line of her spine. It was a touch of absolute consensus. There was no hesitation, no question of propriety. He fastened the clasp. Eliza turned to face him. The turquoise rested against her collarbone, a bright promise against her skin. Around them, the people of the camp nodded. Some smiled. The tension evaporated, replaced by the simple acceptance of a new reality. The children went back to their game. The women returned to the cooking fires. Later, after a meal of stew and flatbread that tasted better than any banquet Eliza had ever known, they sat by their own small fire at the edge of the camp. The stars were out, millions of them. A river of diamond dust spilled across the black velvet of the sky. The air was cold, but the fire was warm. Tahoma sat close to her, their shoulders touching. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. Eliza looked up at the vast, indifferent universe above them. She thought of the uncertainty of tomorrow, the harshness of the winter that would come, the soldiers who might one day find this canyon. "No," she said, and she meant it. Tahoma turned his face to hers. The firelight danced in his eyes, softening the sharp angles of his face. He reached up and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing over the faint scar where the rock had cut her during the fight. "You are a warrior. Eliza Hart," he whispered. He leaned in. The kiss was not an explosion. It was not the desperate, frantic collision of two people trying to survive. It was slow. It was deep. It was the settling of the earth after an earthquake. It tasted of smoke and promise. It was a kiss that sealed the pact the necklace had begun. It was a claiming of each other, not as property, but as partners in a world that wanted them both broken. When they pulled apart, Eliza rested her head on his shoulder. She watched the sparks from the fire rise up, swirling into the darkness to join the stars. She realized then that she was not running anymore. For 2 years, she had been running from her father's death, running from Clay's pressure, running from her own loneliness. Now, she was still. She had lost her station. She had lost her standing in society. She had lost her name in the town records. But she had found her conscience. She had found her courage. And she had found love. The message was clear in the silence of the mountains. Love did not always grow in the manicured gardens of civilization. Sometimes it grows like the desert grass after a wildfire rising from the blackened earth, feeding on the ash, growing slow and tough and resilient. It did not need a gardener. It did not need permission. It just needed the sun and the will to survive. Justice had not come from a gavel in a courtroom. It had come from the small choice to drag a wounded man into the shade. It had come from the choice to tell the truth when a lie was easier. It had come from the choice to turn her back on the safe road. "Love and freedom," Eliza whispered to the night air. "Earned, not gifted." Tahoma squeezed her hand. "Earned," he agreed. They sat there as the fire burned down to embers, two silhouettes against the immense, ancient backdrop of the West, riding toward a different horizon, together. Thank you for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Eliza and Tahoma's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and hit the like button. And if you want to help this story reach even more people, please support the channel by hitting the hype button. Your support keeps the campfire burning. Thank you.